When they returned to the campfire circle, they discovered that everyone had been in on the joke and had enjoyed it. "I guess that makes you one of us," Vandermeer said. "We've all had our scares." Karen wondered if she was the type of person who didn't like trickery. Deep down, she resented being made to show her fear, but then she realized that no one had actually seen any evidence of her fear. It was just fun for them. Soon after, Vandermeer called for bed. Following Joyce's instructions, Karen sat on their bed, took off her boots, folded her coat and sweater at her head, and slid under the blankets. The bed felt strange and hard, but Karen felt a sense of relief and rest she had never experienced before. She lay on her back, appreciating the luxury of lying down. Joyce snuggled up to her in a sisterly way and said, "Don't cover your head. If it rains, I'll wake up and pull up the tarp." "Good night, Karen," Tristan said before quickly falling asleep. Karen, however, couldn't seem to drift off. She was too sore from the previous day's events, and the unfamiliarity of her surroundings made it difficult to relax. She lay there, staring at the dark shadows around her and the flickering lights on the cedar tree. Eventually, she concluded that this experience might be worth the discomfort, but only once in a lifetime. She couldn't deny that she would have enjoyed herself more if her ego hadn't been bruised. Karen knew that it was impossible to fully enjoy oneself while feeling uncomfortable and afraid. She thought about how she would challenge Joyce Vandermeer to face unfamiliar situations in New York. Karen's thoughts drifted until she eventually fell asleep. Suddenly, a voice interrupted her dreams. Tristan was standing over her, holding a sprig of cedar. "Karen, the day is almost over. We need to roll up your bedding. Will you get up?" he said cheerfully. Karen groaned. "What time is it?" "It's almost 6, Tristan replied. "What? Do you expect me to get up at that ungodly hour?" Karen protested. "We're all up. Joyce is even eating breakfast. It's going to be a bad day, I'm afraid," Tristan said with a hint of concern. "We need to get packed and moving before the rain hits," Tristan said, urging Karen to hurry. "Why do girls leave home?" she asked, sounding forlorn. "To make poor devils like me happy," he replied with a grin. Karen felt better instantly, grateful for his infectious smile. She wished she could throw herself into this adventure with more enthusiasm. As she tried to sit up, Karen exclaimed, "My anatomy has become disconnected. Do I look a mess?" Tristan assured her she looked great, with her hair mussed just right. "Come on, Karen, let's get going," he said, and she did her best to get ready despite her sore muscles and swollen feet. Karen struggled to pull on her damp boots, wincing in pain, but she managed it, thanks to Tristan's help. He brought her warm water, which made her feel better. Joyce greeted her with food, and Karen was surprised to find she had an appetite despite her discomfort. Tristan joked that at least she wouldn't starve on the trip. "Come climb the ridge with me," Tristan suggested. "I want you to see the view to the north and east." Karen followed him through the cedars and up a slow red earth slope away from the lake. As they approached, Karen noticed a green hill with a flat red rock on top. It seemed like an easy climb, but her eyes deceived her, and it was much farther and higher than she thought. Tristan expressed his admiration for the location and said he would buy the 640 acres of land if he had the money. He envisioned a ranch with a cabin on the flat bench below the bluff, where they could see all the way to Sunset Peak. The area had a good spring of granite water and excellent grazing, but it was only a watering place for sheep and cattle. Karen looked down and appreciated Tristan's wish to own the place. She felt a sudden desire to get possession of the land before anyone else did and hold it for Tristan. However, she knew this would conflict with her intention of persuading him to return east. As she looked out at the wild and lonely Arizona landscape, Karen saw ragged cedars of gray and green, lines of red earth, and a round space of water gleaming pale under the lowering clouds. In the distance, isolated hills curved strangely and wandered away to a black uplift of earth obscured in the sky. These appeared to be mere steps leading her sight farther and higher to the cloud-navigated sky, where rosy and golden effulgence betokened the sunrise and the east. Karen held her breath as a transformation occurred before her eyes. Tristan explained that it was a stormy sunrise, but his words did not convince her. The sun rose behind the storm clouds, painting them with a magical brush. Karen watched as the gray clouds surrendered to the colors, widening the rifts and vanishing the gloom. Beyond the billowy, rolling, creamy edges of clouds, the soft, exquisite, fresh blue sky shone, accompanied by a burst of molten gold that poured a sea of sunlight from east to west. The round foothills were transfigured, bathed in an ethereal light, and the silver mists that overhung them faded away. Karen noticed a rosy flush crowning the symmetrical domes. Down-dropping veils of rain, just touched with the sunrise tint, streamed in drifting slow movement from cloud to earth to the south, while to the north the range of foothills lifted toward the majestic dome of Sunset Peak, a volcanic upheaval of red and purple cinders. The San Francisco peaks, half lost in the clouds, still dominated the desert scene. Karen understood now what had been told her about this peak. Volcanic fires had thrown up a colossal mound of cinders burned forever to the hues of the setting sun. In every light and shade of day it held true to its name. As Karen gazed, the rifts began to close and the golden radiance of sunrise vanished. Under a gray, lowering, coalescing pall of cloud, the round hills returned to their bleak somberness, and the green desert took again its cold sheen. Tristan asked Karen if she enjoyed the view and said it was nothing compared to what she would experience if she stayed until the weather gets warm. "I want you to see the beauty of a summer dawn on the painted desert, and witness the clouds roll in at noon from the horizon, and experience a sunset painted with purples and golds. If you don't fall in love with this land after that, then I'll give up," said the cowboy to Karen. Karen appreciated the breathtaking views that she had just seen, but his words still lingered in her mind, both thought-provoking and disturbing. He kindly hoped that she would stay until summer, but Karen's visit had to be short and end with his return east with her. If she couldn't persuade him to leave, he might not want to go for a while, as he had written in his letter. Karen grew troubled in mind, but her thoughts were interrupted as they reached camp and the Mustang Spillbeans stood ready for her to ride. Spillbeans seemed surprised to see Karen mount him again, with one ear up and the other down. He looked at her with mild surprise, as if to say, "Well, hello there, tenderfoot. Are you going to ride me again?" Karen remembered that she had vowed to ride him, and with no other choice she climbed into the saddle. She imagined the thrill of riding off into the open miles ahead, but that feeling was short-lived once Spillbeans began to trot. The day ahead promised to be another miserable one for Karen, with gray stretches of distance and the monotony of cedar trees. She kept her eyes down, hoping to find sandy or rocky terrain where Spillbeans couldn't trot. At noon the group stopped at a sheep ranch belonging to Vandermeer. Tristan was too busy to spend time with Karen, leaving her feeling even more alone. She saw the hours swallow up both misery and bliss as she rode through the same monotonous landscape. Joyce was a natural horsewoman and rode alongside the men wherever they went. Karen, on the other hand, was eager to stretch her legs and get off her horse, Spillbeans. The cabin they came across was deserted, damp, and had a foul smell, so Karen didn't stay inside for long. The weather took a turn for the worse, with rain and snow falling, making Karen's prospects even more disagreeable. However, Charlie, the herder, brought her a cup of hot soup and some bread and butter, which lifted her spirits. Tristan and Vandermeer returned with Joyce, and they all enjoyed some lunch together. Karen was soon back on her Mustang, with Tristan helping her don a sticky rubber coat, which protected her from the harsh elements. Karen asked where they were headed next, and Tristan laughed, understanding her frustration. Karen felt guilty for not complaining more and admired Tristan's fortitude. As the afternoon wore on, the weather worsened, and Karen struggled to keep going. The wind was raw, the cold was biting, and the rain felt like sharp ice on her skin. Snow began to fall, covering the ground in white. Karen knew this was the hardest ride of her life, but she didn't let anyone see her struggle. Tristan praised her for adapting so well to the harsh conditions, and Joyce kept an eye out for any trouble Karen might encounter as a tenderfoot. Karen Oakman was in a world of hurt. Her trusty steed, Spillbeans, had slowed down to a crawl, but Karen was too miserable to care. The weather was atrocious, with rain, hail, sleet, and snow beating down on her. Her feet felt like blocks of ice, and every step Spillbeans took sent shooting pains throughout her body. She fell behind the rest of the group and tried to walk for a bit, but it was no use. She couldn't fall too far behind, so she mounted up again and rode on. Karen was convinced that this trip would be the end of her. The endless flat land was dreary and unforgiving. It felt like she rode for hours just to cover a single mile. The rest of the party was strung out ahead of her, each person for themselves. Karen shut her eyes and held on for dear life. She couldn't endure another mile of this. Suddenly Spillbeans took off at a trot, and Karen's heart sank. She desperately tried to rein him in, but he refused to slow down. She saw a cabin in the distance and knew they were probably stopping there for the night, but she didn't think she could make it. The pain in her side was like a knife twisting in her gut. When Spillbeans finally caught up with the others, Tristan offered her a hand, but Karen was too proud to show her agony. She soldiered on, stiff-legged and propped up by the pommel of her saddle. The stabbing pain only got worse, but Karen refused to give in. Joyce exclaimed with joy, "Karen, you've ridden for 25 miles on a terrible day. We all got to give you props for that. I ain't gonna lie, I didn't think you could handle it. Spillbeans is the most difficult horse we've got, and he has the roughest gait." Chapter 5. Karen sat back in a plush seat, basking in the warmth of a roaring fire. The smoke from the flames rose lazily up the chimney, filling the air with a pleasant aroma. As she relaxed, her thoughts turned to the revelations that familiar experiences could bring. Getting off a horse that had caused her pain, satisfying her hunger, and resting her weary body by the fire were all simple pleasures that she had never truly appreciated before. It made her realize that to truly understand and appreciate the good things in life, one had to experience the bad as well. This thought led her to wonder if it could be applied to all experiences. Were there things in the world that she had yet to discover, things that could broaden her narrow view of life? Just as she was deep in thought, Joyce's words brought her back to reality. "Sure, the worst is yet to come," Joyce drawled. Karen couldn't help but wonder if this ominous statement had to do with the rest of their journey. She pushed her curiosity aside, knowing that the truth would reveal itself soon enough. Tristan interrupted her thoughts, asking if the girls planned on sleeping in the cabin. Joyce replied, "Sure, it's cold and wet outside." Karen settled in for the night, her mind still racing with thoughts of the unknown. "Well, Felix, the Mexican herder, told me that some Navajos had been staying here," said Joyce. "Navajos? You mean Indians?" Karen asked with interest. "Sure do," replied Joyce. "I knew that. But don't mind Tristan. He's always playing tricks on us, Karen. He would tell us to sleep outside in the rain." Vandermeer laughed heartily. "Well, I'd rather get some things any day than a bad cold." "I've had both," said Joyce in her easy drawl, "and I'd prefer the cold, but for Karen's sake." "Please don't consider me," interrupted Karen. She was offended by the crude conversation. "Well, my dear," Tristan interjected, "it's a bad night outside. We'll all sleep in here." "Tristan, you're a brave man," drawled Joyce. Karen lay awake in the dark cabin, feeling uneasy and imagining things crawling on her. The fire had gone out and the room was cold. Rain pattered on the roof and mice rustled around. She tried to stay awake, but eventually succumbed to her exhaustion. The next morning was sunny, and Karen felt better. The men had work to do nearby, so Joyce suggested she take Karen for a ride to the top of the first foothill. "Sure thing," said Joyce. "I want to get out of camp anyway." Joyce casually mentioned that Lee Stanton would be arriving soon, which caused Tristan to smirk and Mr. Vandermeer to grin in disbelief. Charlie, the herder, even winked at Karen, leading her to believe that Joyce only ran off to be pursued. Karen found herself oddly pleased at the arrival of Lee Stanton, but she admitted to herself that women, including herself, were as mysterious as the sea, yet as transparent as crystal water. Lee arrived in camp before anyone left and made a good impression on Karen. She found him singularly handsome, with his black sombrero, flannel shirt, blue jeans, and big roweled spurs. Karen learned that Lee was the overseer of the sheep hands, which interested Vandermeer and Tristan, who were not particularly interested in cattle raising. Vandermeer suggested riding over to see when Ryan would be dipping the sheep. Tristan whispered to Vandermeer that Karen wouldn't be interested in seeing a sheep dip, but Karen heard and felt an intense and rebellious desire to see it. Karen felt confident that she could impress Tristan with her equestrian skills. After all, she had endured the grueling pace of the most stubborn horse on the range. As she pondered this, the men finished their discussion, and Lee Stanton turned his attention to Joyce. Karen could tell that Lee was smitten with Joyce, although she couldn't quite read Joyce's intentions. Lee greeted Joyce with a cheerful smile, but Karen could see through his facade. He was clearly nervous and unsure of himself. Joyce seemed unimpressed and asked Lee what he was sorry about. Karen decided to give them some space and wandered away, feeling sorry for Lee but also sensing that Joyce might not be the easiest person to deal with. Later, Karen joined Lee and Joyce on a ride up the foothill. She struggled to keep up with them, still sore from her previous ride. The terrain changed from rocky ground to black cinders and sparse grass, giving the foothill its distinctive gray hue from a distance. Karen couldn't help but wonder what kind of drama would unfold between Lee and Joyce on this ride. The gentle slope made the ascent an easy task, much to Karen's surprise. As she climbed higher, she was amazed at the height she had achieved over the desert. The sight of the green-gray cedar forest that stretched down to Lost Mule was a welcome change from the monotony of the flatlands. The mountains behind her were a magnificent sight, with their white snow-covered slopes standing out against the gray sky. The cinders made it difficult for the horses, and Karen was forced to dismount and walk when there was still a third of the ascent left to be covered. At first, walking was a relief, but soon the soft cinders began to drag at her feet, causing her to slip back with every step. Karen paused for a rest when her legs grew tired, but the last few hundred yards of loose cinders taxed her strength to the limit. She grew hot, wet, and out of breath, with her heart laboring under the strain. Despite the pain of raw blisters and the miserable sensation of staggering on under a leaden weight, Karen refused to give up. She was determined to please Tristan and did not want the Westerners to consider her a weakling. As she continued to climb, she noticed that Joyce and Stanton were engaged in a heated argument, with Stanton's red face and forceful gestures attesting to his anger. Joyce was clearly tired of arguing, and in response to a sharp reprimand, she retorted, "Well, I was different after he arrived." Stanton recoiled quickly and passionately as if he had been stung. Karen couldn't help but hear Joyce's words, and inwardly at least her reaction must have been similar to Stanton's. She forgot the purpose of their climb and looked off to her right at the green plain without really seeing it. A vague sadness weighed on her soul. Was there going to be a mess of destinies here, a conflict of wills, a crossing of loves? Joyce's brief confession could not be taken lightly. Did she mean that she loved Tristan? Karen began to fear it, another reason why she had to persuade Tristan to go back east. But the closer Karen got to what she knew must be a test, the more she dreaded it. This raw, crude West may have presented her with a situation beyond her control, and as she dragged her weighted feet through the ashes, kicking up little puffs of black dust, she felt what she admitted was an irrational resentment towards these Westerners and their barren, isolated, and boundless world. "Karen," called Joyce, "come look-see, as the Indians say. Here is Tristan's painted desert, and I think it's definitely worth seeing." To Karen's surprise, she found herself on the knob of the foothill, and when she looked out across a suddenly distinguishable void, she seemed struck by the immensity of something she couldn't comprehend. She dropped her reins and looked slowly, as if drawn, listening to Joyce's voice. "That thin green line of cottonwoods down there is the Little Colorado River," Joyce said. "I reckon it's 60 miles all downhill. The Painted Desert begins there, as well as the Navajo Reservation. You see the white strips, the red veins, the yellow bars, the black lines. They're all desert steps leading up and up for miles. That sharp black peak over yonder is Wildcat. It's about 100 miles out. See how the desert stretches away to the right, growing dim and getting lost in the distance? We ain't too familiar with that country, but we sure know the landmarks of the North Country. Look at that Sawtooth Range. The Indians call it Echo Cliffs. At the far end, it drops off into the Colorado River. Lee's Ferry is about 160 miles from there. That ragged black rent you see is the Grand Canyon. Looks like a thread, don't it? But let me tell you, Karen, it's one hell of a hole. Over to the left you can see the tremendous wall rising and turning to come this way. That's the north wall of the canyon. It ends at the Great Bluff, Greenland Point. See the black fringe above the bar of gold? That's a belt of pine trees. It's about 80 miles across this ragged old stone washboard of a desert. Now turn and look straight ahead and strain your eyes over Wildcat. See that rim purple dome? You gotta look real hard. I'm glad it's clear and the sun is shining. We don't get this kind of view often. That purple dome is Navajo Mountain, about 200 miles away." Karen felt a strange pull and slowly walked forward until she stood at the extreme edge of the summit. What was it that confused her sight? The desert slope going down and down, the colors, the distance, and the vastness of space. The wind that blew in her face seemed to have the openness of the whole world behind it. It was cold, sweet, dry, and exhilarating. It breathed of untainted vastness. Karen's memories of the Adirondacks faded into pastorals, and her images of European scenery changed to operetta settings. She had nothing to compare this illimitable space to. "Oh, America!" was her unconscious tribute. Stanton and Joyce had come to stand beside her. The young man chuckled. "Well, now, Miss Karen, you couldn't say it better. When I was in camp training for service overseas, I used to remember how this looked. And it seemed like one of the things I was going to fight for. I don't like the idea of the Germans taking over my painted desert. I never got a chance to fight for it, but I was damn willing to," exclaimed Stanton. "This is our America, Karen," said Joyce in a soft tone. Karen had never understood the meaning of the word. The vastness of the West was thrown at her. What she saw, far-reaching and boundless, was just a tiny dot on the map. "Do people live out there?" she asked, gesturing with her hand. "A few white traders and some Indian tribes," replied Stanton, "but you can ride for days and not see a single soul." What did the satisfaction in his voice mean? Did Westerners seek solitude? Karen turned her gaze from the empty desert to look at her companions. Stanton's eyes were narrowed. His expression had changed. Lean and hard, his face looked like bronze. The carefree humor was gone, as was the heated flush of his argument with Joyce. The girl, too, had changed subtly, responding to an influence that had subdued and softened her. She was silent, her eyes shining with understanding and embracing everything. She was beautiful then. Karen, quick to sense emotions, caught a glimpse of a strong and unwavering soul that spiritualized the brown, freckled face. Karen turned to look out into the incomprehensible abyss and up to the towering heights, white, red, and yellow, and further to the mystical haze of distance. She couldn't grasp the significance of Joyce's description of miles. She couldn't estimate distance. But she didn't need to understand that to realize her perceptions were engulfed by the magnitude of it all. Until now, the power of her eyes had been unknown. How magnificent it was to see so far. She could see, but what was she seeing? Space first, erasing space, shrinking her preconceived images, and then astonishing colors. What did she know about color? It's no surprise that artists have never quite captured the true essence of mountains and deserts in their paintings. The hustle and bustle of the city's working class has never experienced the sheer beauty and grandeur of these natural wonders. But what if they had? Just breathing in the pure, untainted air or catching a glimpse of the endless expanse of colored sand and rock would surely make anyone understand what it means to be as free as an eagle. Karen's mind was racing with thoughts of freedom as she gazed out into this open domain. She had yet to watch eagles in flight, but this environment was enough to leave her stunned. How would the people who lived here be affected by this way of life? Would they grow in proportion to the nature that surrounded them? The influence of heredity could never compare to the shaping of character that this environment could provide. Joyce was ready to head back, but Karen had lost track of time. She didn't feel the cold wind that was beginning to pick up. Stanton understood her discomfort and suggested she come back again and again until she felt at ease. Karen couldn't understand why she felt so uneasy. The open expanse of sand and rock was beautiful and glorious, but it left her feeling vaguely unhappy. She looked out again at the steep, black-cindered slope with its soft gray patches of grass, shearing down and out in rolling slopes to merge with the cedar-dotted level. Nothing moved below except for the red-tailed hawk that sailed across her vision. The desert floor was still and gray as it stretched out into the distance, losing its black dots and gaining bronze spots of stone. Each inch of gray magnified into a league-long roll, falling away into the plain and prairie. Through the vast expanse of the steppes, Karen traveled on and on until she reached the green thread of a desert river that blocked her path. Beyond the river lay the white sand, where whirlwinds of dust rose up in funnel-shaped spouts. The sand led up to the horizon-wide ribs and ridges of red, walls of yellow, and mountains of black. In the distance, a dim mound of purple added an ethereal touch against the deep blue cloud-curtained band of sky. Just as suddenly as the sun had shone, it was obscured, and the world of colorful flame went out as if a blaze had died. Deprived of its fire, the desert seemed to retreat, to fade coldly and gloomily, to lose its great landmarks in dim obscurity. To the north, the canyon country yawned with innumerable gray jaws, ragged and hard. The riven earth took on a different character, growing flat and mirroring the vast gray cloud expanse like the sea. The sublime vanished, but the desolate remained. It was like gazing down into chaos. A hawk had crossed her vision earlier, and now a raven sailed by, black as coal, uttering a hoarse croak. "Quoth the raven," murmured Karen with a half-bitter laugh as she turned away shuddering in spite of an effort of self-control. "Maybe he meant this wonderful and terrible West is never for such as I. Come, let us go." Karen rode all afternoon in the rear of the caravan, gradually succumbing to the cold, raw wind and the aches and pains she had subjected her flesh to. Nevertheless, she finished the day's journey and, despite her soreness, got off her horse without aid. Camp was made at the edge of the devastated timber zone that Karen had found so dispiriting. The landscape was a desolate sight. Everywhere Karen looked there were fallen trees and stumps, with only a few melancholy pines still standing. The cattle grazing on the bleached grass looked just as forlorn as the trees. The sun set fitfully, leaving the land in twilight and shadows. Karen was so exhausted and weary that she was content to sit by the campfire. Even the thought of food failed to arouse her appetite. Darkness crept in and the wind moaned through the pines. Karen was grateful to crawl into bed, and not even the threat of skunks could keep her awake. The next morning, Karen struggled to rise, brush her hair, and pull on her boots. The cold, bleak forest land seemed to emphasize her emptiness, roughness, and crudeness. She couldn't help but hate it all. If these feelings continued to grow, she thought she might even hate Tristan. Despite this, she was determined to continue on, see the sheep dip, and ride that fiendish Mustang until the trip was over. Getting in the saddle and starting the journey that morning was a challenge that made Karen feel sick. Tristan and Joyce could see how she was feeling, and they left her alone. Karen was grateful for their understanding, as it showed their respect for her. She was also pleased to discover that after the first painful quarter hour of riding, she began to feel better. After several hours of riding, she wasn't suffering any particular pain, although she was weaker. After a long journey, the cut-over land finally gave way to a forest of straggling pines. Karen could see the road winding southward and down into a wide, shallow canyon. Through the trees, she caught a glimpse of a stream of water, open fields of green, log fences, cabins, and blue smoke. The chug of a gasoline engine and the baa-baa of sheep filled the air. Tristan waited for her to catch up before warning her about the sheep camp they were approaching. "Karen, this is one of Vandermeer's sheep camps. It's not a very pleasant place. You won't care to see the sheep dip, so I'm suggesting you wait here," he said. "Nothing doing, Tristan," she interrupted. "I'm going to see what there is to see." Tristan tried to dissuade her, warning her about the stench and the way the men handled the sheep, but Karen was determined. "Suppose it does make me sick. Wouldn't you think more of me if I could stand it?" she challenged him. They rode out of the woods and into an open valley that could have been picturesque if not for the work of man. Karen could barely hear Tristan over the loud baa-baa of sheep. A log fence ran along the edge of the open ground, and a mud dam held back a pool of stagnant water, slimy and green. Several log cabins, rough-hewn and gray with age, stood inside the enclosure, and beyond that were large corrals. From the opposite side of the corrals, boisterous male voices, the thumping of hooves, splashing, the chugging of an engine, and the constant bleating of sheep could be heard. Vandermeer's crew dismounted and fastened their horses to the top rail of the fence. When Karen attempted to dismount, Tristan attempted to dissuade her, insisting that she could see just fine from where she was. Karen, however, dismounted and followed Joyce. Vandermeer called out to Tristan, "Hey, Ryan needs more hands. We'll help out for a couple of hours." Karen soon joined Joyce at the first corral, which was packed with sheep. The sheep formed a dense, woolly mass, mostly white with a hint of pink. When Joyce climbed up on the fence, the flock stampeded as one, thundering to the far end of the corral. A few old rams with large, curling horns turned around, and some of the ewes climbed onto the tightly packed mass. Karen enjoyed observing them. She couldn't find anything wrong with the scene. The next corral held a similar number of sheep, as well as a few Mexicans who were apparently herding them into a narrow lane that led further down. Karen saw men's heads above other corral fences and a thick yellowish smoke rising from somewhere. "Karen, do you have the guts to watch the dip?" asked Joyce teasingly. "That's my middle name," Karen replied flippantly. Both Tristan and Joyce seemed to be trying to bring out Karen's worst side, and they were succeeding. Joyce chuckled, enjoying Karen's ready slang. She led Karen along the log fence, through a massive open gate, and across a broad pen to another fence, which she scaled. Karen followed her, not particularly eager to look ahead. A strong odor had begun to waft into Karen's sensitive nostrils. Joyce led Karen down a short lane and over another fence. They both sat on the top log, with Karen standing on the second log. Suddenly a horrible stench hit Karen like a punch in the face. Her vision became blurry, and she saw what looked like smoke, people moving around, and sheep running through the mud. The smell was so bad that Karen had to close her eyes and grip the top log tightly with her knees to keep from falling over. She had never experienced such a sickening feeling before. It felt like her whole body was being attacked. Even the worst seasickness she had ever had was nothing compared to this. Karen gasped for air and covered her nose with her fingers to block the smell. When she opened her eyes, she saw a small pen directly beneath her. Sheep were being driven into it from a larger corral. The drivers were shouting, and the sheep were pushing each other forward. 2 men were working in the small pen. One was a large, muscular man wearing an undershirt and filthy overalls. He held a cloth in his hand and walked towards the nearest sheep. He wrapped the cloth around the sheep's neck and dragged it forward with ease, showing great strength. Then he threw the sheep into a pit that was on the side of the pen. The sheep sank into a murky, muddy pool and disappeared. But suddenly its head and shoulders came up, and it began to half-walk, half-swim down a narrow box-like ditch with other floundering sheep. As Karen approached the ditch, she saw men on either side with poles that had crooks at the end. They were pressing and pulling the sheep along to the end of the ditch and driving them up a boarded incline into another corral where many other sheep huddled. The sheep were now a dirty, muddy color, like the liquid they had been immersed in. Souse, splash. Sheep after sheep went into the dip. Occasionally one did not go under, and a man would press it under with the crook and quickly lift its head. The work went on with precision and speed, despite the yells, trampling, baa-baas, and the incessant action that gave an effect of confusion. Karen noticed a pipe leading from a huge boiler to the ditch. The dark fluid was running out of it. From a rusty old engine with a big smokestack poured the strangling smoke. A man broke open a sack of yellow powder and dumped it into the ditch. Then he poured an acid-like liquid after it. "Sulfur and nicotine," yelled Joyce up at Karen. "The dip's poison. If a sheep opens its mouth, it's usually a goner, but sometimes they save one." Karen wanted to tear herself away from this disgusting spectacle, but it held her with some fascination. She saw Tristan and Vandermeer fall in line with the other men and work like beavers. These 2 pacemakers in the small pen kept the sheep coming so fast that every worker below had a task cut out for him. Suddenly Joyce squealed and pointed. "There! That sheep didn't come up," she cried. "Sure, he opened his mouth." Then Karen saw Tristan energetically plunge his hooked pole in and out and around until he had located the submerged sheep. He lifted its head above the dip. The sheep showed no sign of life. Down on his knees dropped Tristan, reaching for the sheep with strong brown hands and hauling it up on the ground where it flopped inert. Tristan pounded and pushed on the sheep, attempting to revive it like a lifeguard rescuing a drowning person. However, the sheep remained unresponsive to his efforts. Vandermeer declared it a lost cause, causing Karen to observe Tristan's hands, arms, and overalls upon his return to their ditch work. As Karen looked around the scene, she was suddenly drawn to the massive man handling the sheep with such force. He hurled them into a pit and shouted, "Ho, ho!" with each throw. Karen was compelled to examine his face and was shocked to be met with the most wicked and intense stare she had ever seen. This man was only slightly older than Tristan, yet he had grizzled hair, a scarred face, thick lips, and fierce brows that framed piercing light eyes. He flashed them at Karen, causing her to quickly close her riding coat as if she had been burned. His gaze was both mesmerizing and repulsive, with the intelligence in his eyes making his beastly behavior all the more difficult to endure. Joyce urged Karen to leave, and they struggled to escape the smoke and stench. As they left, the big man in the pen called out, "Adios, pretty eyes." Joyce revealed that his name was Hayes Ruff, the toughest man on the range. "I sure would like to take a shot at him," Karen exclaimed, eyeing Ruff with disdain. "I'm going to tell Dad and Tristan." "Please don't," pleaded Joyce Vandermeer, sensing the violent spirit in Karen's voice and eyes. "Your dad needs hands these days, that's why he's being lenient. But Tristan will cowhide Ruff, and I want to see him do it." They made their way back to the horses, retrieved their lunches from the saddlebags, and settled in a sunny, sheltered spot to eat and chat. Karen struggled to swallow her food, the smell of dip and sheep having permeated everything. Tristan had known her better than she knew herself and had wanted to spare her from the unpleasant experience, but Karen was too stubborn to regret it. "Karen, I have to say you've stuck it out better than any tenderfoot we've had here," Joyce complimented her. "Coming from a Western girl, that's a compliment I won't forget," Karen replied. "We've had terrible weather, and to end the trip at this sheep dip hole. Tristan sure wanted you to experience the real thing," Joyce chuckled. "He didn't want me to come on the trip, especially here," Karen protested. "Sure, I know, but he let you," Joyce countered. "Neither Tristan nor any man can stop me from doing what I want to do," Karen asserted. "Well, I beg to differ," Joyce drawled. "Tristan Mitterwald isn't the man you knew before the war." "No, he's not. But that doesn't change anything," Karen insisted. "Karen, we're not well acquainted, and I'm not your kind. I don't know your Eastern ways, but I know what the West does to a man," Joyce cautioned. "Your friend was destroyed by the war, both physically and mentally. It was a tough time for Tristan, and my mother and I felt sorry for him. We thought he wouldn't make it out alive. Did you know he was exposed to gas and had 5 hemorrhages?" "Yes, I knew about the gas, but he never told me about the hemorrhages," replied Karen. "Well, he had them," Joyce continued. "The last one was the worst. Every time he coughed, he would cough up blood. It was terrible. I begged him not to cough, but he just smiled and whispered, 'I'll quit.' And he did. The doctor came from Flagstaff and packed him in ice. Tristan sat propped up all night without moving a muscle, and the bleeding stopped. After that, we put him on the porch where he could breathe fresh air all the time. The Arizona air has healing properties. It's dry and full of cedar and pine. Tristan got better, and I think the West cured his mind, too." "Cured him of what?" Karen asked curiously. "I don't know," Joyce replied, throwing up her hands. "I never could understand it. But I hated what the war did to him." Karen was exhausted and leaned back against the log. She wanted to be jealous of Joyce, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Joyce deserved better. Karen's inner conflict was wearing her down. "Karen, you're worn out," Joyce said. "You don't have to deny it. There's no sense in you killing yourself or me letting you." "I'm going to go tell Dad we want to head back home," she said, leaving Karen behind. The word home stuck in Karen's mind and wouldn't leave. Suddenly she realized what it meant to be homesick. The comfort, ease, luxury, rest, sweetness, pleasure, cleanliness, and gratification to all the senses that came with home haunted her thoughts. Karen had needed all her willpower to keep from miserably failing on this trip, but she hadn't failed. However, being in the West had affronted, disgusted, shocked, and alienated her. In that moment she couldn't be fair-minded, she knew it, but she didn't care. Karen looked around her, and only one of the cabins was in sight. It seemed to be a home for some of these men. On one side of the peaked rough roof, a kind of porch had been built out beyond the wall. On that wall hung the motliest assortment of things Karen had ever seen. Utensils, sheep and cow hides, saddles, harness, leather clothes, ropes, old sombreros, shovels, stovepipe, and many other articles for which she couldn't find a name. The most striking characteristic manifest in this collection was that of service. How they had been used. They had enabled people to live under primitive conditions. Somehow this fact inhibited Karen's sense of repulsion at their rude and uncouth appearance. Had any of her forefathers ever been pioneers? Karen didn't know, but the thought was disturbing and thought-provoking. Many times at home, when she was dressing for dinner, she had gazed into the mirror at the graceful lines of her throat and arms, at the proud poise of her head, at the alabaster whiteness of her skin, and wonderingly she had asked of her image, "Can it be possible that I am a descendant of cavemen?" She had never been able to realize it, yet she knew it was true. Maybe somewhere down her ancestry line there was a great-great-grandmother who lived a primitive life and used the same tools and necessities that hung on the cabin wall. She helped some man conquer the wilderness, live in it, and reproduce his offspring. Karen remembered Tristan's words, work and children. They echoed in her mind, but she couldn't interpret their meaning and how it related to this moment. Karen was physically sore and sick, making it hard for her to be receptive. She was receiving keen impressions, but it was all a problem. Karen grew tired of thinking and wanted the hours and days to fly so she could be home again. The deserted woods were dreary, with no birds, squirrels, or creatures around. Across the canyon, Karen saw gaunt, ragged, and lumbering cattle. The scent of sheep came on the breeze, and time seemed to stand still. Karen pondered on, her mind a stream of consciousness over which she had no control. Finally, Joyce returned with the men. Karen saw Tristan and knew that Joyce had not yet told him about Hayes Ruff, the sheep dipper. "Karen, you're a real sport," declared Tristan with a rare smile that she loved. "It's a dreadful mess. And to think you stood it. Why, old Fifth Avenue, if you needed to make another hit with me, you've done it." Karen was amazed and pleased with Tristan's warmth. She didn't understand why it would have made any difference to him whether she stood the ordeal or not. Every day she seemed to drift a little farther from a real understanding of her lover. Karen felt a sense of relief as she heard his words of praise. It gave her the strength to continue the journey back to Lost Mule. After 4 long hours, Karen finally made it back to the house. The sky was so dark that no one saw her struggle as she half slipped and half fell from her horse. She managed to gather herself and climb the steps to enter the warm and inviting living room. The fireplace was lit, casting a cheerful red glow across the room. Tristan's loyal hound, Mose, wagged his tail eagerly at the sight of her. The table was set with delicious-smelling food, and Joyce was warming her hands by the fire. Lee Stanton stood by the mantel, gazing at Karen with a look of devotion on his face. Vandermeer was already seated at the head of the table, calling out heartily for everyone to come and eat. Mrs. Vandermeer's face was beaming with the spirit of the home. And then Karen saw Tristan waiting for her, watching her come with a look of pride and hope in his eyes. In that moment, Karen realized that she had grown immensely in the eyes of her friends, yet felt strangely small in her own. Chapter 6. When spring finally arrived in Lost Mule Canyon, it quickly transitioned into summer, leaving Karen with little time to suffer from the fever that typically accompanies early June in the east. The verdant grass emerged as if by magic, along with the unfolding of green buds into leaves, the blossoming of bluebells and primroses, and the stunning display of apple and peach blossoms in shades of white and pink against the clear blue sky. The once murky Lost Mule transformed into a crystal-clear brook, meandering slowly through the stone-walled nooks and gurgling cheerfully over small waterfalls. The mornings were clear and cool, but the midday sun beat down relentlessly. The nights were dark and starry, enveloping the land in a melancholic embrace. Karen had persisted in her riding and climbing, determined to prove to herself that she was a true thoroughbred. She pushed through the pain and discomfort, shedding pounds and gaining a healthy golden-brown complexion that she knew her eastern friends would envy. Her muscles grew stronger, her body leaner, and she felt a newfound sense of freedom and exhilaration that she had never experienced before. She realized that she had shed countless superficialities that she had previously believed were essential to her happiness. Karen had set out to conquer Tristan's pride and impress Joyce Vandermeer, but her quest had backfired. She had won Tristan's admiration and Joyce's respect, but her motives were revealed to be shallow and ignoble. She tried to push away the sweetness of her achievement, but it lingered in her heart. As the June days flew by, Karen grew increasingly reluctant to broach the subject of taking Tristan back east. She hated the ruggedness and rawness of the West, and couldn't bear the thought of Tristan wasting his life there. But she couldn't bring herself to discuss it with him just yet. Was he still wasting time? Karen Oakman occasionally voiced her concerns, though she was often too content with her walks and rides with Tristan to bring them up. She cherished those moments, and her love for him grew each day. But there was always something nagging at her, a feeling that he would never be completely hers. She sensed a restraint in him, a melancholy aloofness that made him seem like an impassive destiny waiting for the inevitable consequences to fall. What did he know that she didn't? It haunted her, and she used all her wiles and charms to try and break through that barrier. Though she could see that he loved her more with each passing day, she couldn't shake the feeling that he would never be her slave. Was it resistance, knowledge, nobility, or doubt? She couldn't say for certain. When Joyce Vandermeer's 20th birthday rolled around in June, everyone in the area was invited to celebrate. Karen donned her stunning white gown once again, relishing in the attention it brought her. She loved creating a sensation, and what were beautiful gowns for if not to be shown off? As the sun began to set on a warm June night, she stood on the porch for a moment, taking in the beauty of the evening star shining brightly against the dusky blue sky. The sound of the nearby waterfall, its gentle murmur filling her ears, was another comfort she had come to rely on. She couldn't quite put into words what this canyon had come to mean to her, but one thing was certain. It had changed her. As she made her way around the corner of the house, she overheard Lee Stanton's voice. He was speaking to Joyce, asking her if she still loved him. It was Joyce's birthday, and she was lost in thought, contemplating both happy and sad memories. She assured Lee that she loved him just as much as ever, but then confessed that she loved another man even more. Lee was beside himself with shock and disbelief. He couldn't believe that Joyce could love two men at the same time. But she was resolute in her feelings, telling Lee that the other man was different, that he was wonderful in a way that Lee could never be. Lee was heartbroken, but Joyce tried to console him, telling him that he was steady, loyal, and would one day be like her father. She spoke of Lee's Western spirit and how he could stand alongside any man. But in the end, Joyce's heart belonged to another, and there was nothing Lee could do to change that. I can't explain it, but I feel it. He's been through hell's fire. Oh, will I ever forget his ravings when he lay so ill? He means more to me than just one man. He's American. You're American too, Lee, and you trained to be a soldier, and you would have made a great one if I know old Arizona. But you weren't called to France. Tristan Mitterwald went. God only knows what that means. But he went, and there's the difference. I saw the wreck of him. I did a little to save his life and his mind. I wouldn't be an American girl if I didn't love him. Oh, Lee, can't you understand? I reckon so. I'm not begrudging Tristan what you care. I'm only afraid I'll lose you. I never promised to marry you, did I? Not in words, but kisses ought to. Yes, kisses mean a lot, she replied. And so far I stand committed. I suppose I'll marry you someday and be damn lucky. I'll be happy too, don't you overlook that hunch. You needn't worry. Tristan is in love with Karen. She's beautiful, rich, and of his class. How could he ever see me? Joyce, you can never tell, replied Stanton thoughtfully. I didn't like her at first, but I'm coming around. The thing is, Joyce, does she love him as you love him? Oh, I think so, I hope so, answered Joyce as if in distress. I'm not so sure. But then I can't understand her. Lord knows I hope so too. If she doesn't, if she goes back east and leaves him here, I reckon my case— Hush, I know she's out here to take him back. Let's go downstairs now. Oh, wait, Joyce, he begged. What's your hurry? Come, give me— There, that's all you get, birthday or no birthday, replied Joyce happily. Karen heard the soft kiss and Stanton's deep breath and then footsteps as they walked away in the darkness toward the stairway. Karen leaned against the log wall. As she ran her hand over the rough wood and caught the scent of pine rosin, Karen felt her heart racing in her chest. From above, she could hear the sound of footsteps and voices, and the soft murmur of the waterfall and babbling brook drifted up to her ears. She knew that listeners never heard good of themselves, but the realization that Joyce Vandermeer loved Tristan deeply was a powerful blow. Though she was saddened, Karen's confidence in her hold on Tristan remained unshaken. What troubled her was the mystery that seemed to surround his transformation of character. This Western girl knew more about Tristan than his fiancée did, and Karen was humiliated to realize that she had been thinking only of herself and her own needs. It was clear that Tristan needed her more than she needed him, and this realization stirred her to pride. When Karen finally descended the stairs to join the assembled company, she was radiant and happy, and many in the room remarked on her beauty and charm. An old Westerner called her an unbroke filly, and another woman compared her to a columbine. I'd like her better if she dressed decent, muttered one of the gaunt range riders, standing with his comrades at the porch door, eyeing the women who had just arrived. Do you reckon that's how they do it back east? Asked another. Maybe, but I bet they're short on silk and sheriffs back there, replied the first. Karen was pleased with the attention she received, but she didn't let it overshadow her friend Joyce. Instead, she taught Joyce how to dance the foxtrot and even got the handsome Tristan to dance with her. Karen was thrilled when Joyce and Lee Stanton danced together, and for once she didn't care about the spectators. Her own moment came when she danced with Tristan, and it reminded her of the days she longed to return to. "Tristan, would you like to go to the plaza with me again and dance between dinner courses like we used to?" Karen whispered to him. "Sure I would, unless Morrison knew you were going to be there," he replied. "Tristan, I wouldn't even see him," she exclaimed. "Any old time you wouldn't see Morrison," he teased. Karen pressed closer to him and said, "Come back and I'll prove it." But he just laughed and didn't respond.